On a gray, drizzling morning, Walter Henderson, an 84-year-old Korean War veteran, is laid to rest in a quiet cemetery with only a pastor, a worker, and his social worker, Anna, present. Known in town as a kind but reserved carpenter, Walter's deeper story unfolds as veterans unexpectedly arrive. Through their tales, we learn of his heroism, saving lives in brutal combat, and his lifelong devotion to his brothers through letters and quiet generosity. As the honor guard forms and taps echo, a question lingers. What more lies hidden in Walter's unassuming legacy? Thank you for honoring Walter's story. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to keep these heroes' legacies alive. Share stories of quiet heroes in your community in the comments. Together, let's ensure no act of service is forgotten. Join us in celebrating those who give selflessly. On a bleak, rain-drenched morning, the small cemetery at the town's edge stood shrouded in mist, its quiet broken only by the soft patter of drizzle on the earth. Three figures gathered near a simple wooden casket, bare of flowers or flags, its unadorned surface a stark contrast to the life it held. A pastor, his Bible clutched tightly, wore a somber expression, while a cemetery worker adjusted his faded cap, his movements restless in the damp air. A middle-aged woman stood beside them, her umbrella trembling slightly in her grip, her eyes reflecting a grief that seemed to echo the gray sky. In the heavy silence, a question lingered, unspoken but piercing. How could a man who gave so much for his nation slip away in such quiet obscurity? Walter Henderson was not one to draw eyes in a crowd. At 84, his frame bore the gentle stoop of a life shaped by toil and unspoken burdens. His steps were slow, each one a quiet testament to years of labor and the weight of memories he held close. A Korean War veteran, Walter's service was a story few in town knew in full, its details locked within the quiet of his heart. He lived in a modest house on the town's outskirts, its faded paint and leaning fence softened by time. When his beloved Mary died 15 years prior, the house fell into a deeper stillness, its rooms echoing with the absence of her laughter. Their son had long since moved across the country, chasing work, and though Walter never spoke of the distance with resentment, a subtle ache flickered in his gaze when neighbors asked about family. In the evenings, he'd sit on his porch, a mug of black coffee warming his hands, watching the sun sink behind distant hills. The fading light seemed to cradle him, offering a solace that words could not. A carpenter by trade, Walter's skill had woven itself into the town's fabric. His hands, now gnarled with arthritis, had once built homes along Main Street, each beam and nail placed with a craftsman's care. When a storm ravaged the town a decade ago, scattering shingles and splintering fences, Walter was there, hammer in hand, moving from house to mend what was broken. He asked for nothing in return, brushing off offers of payment with a soft smile and a quiet, "Just pass it on." That was his way, giving without expectation, a man whose kindness was as steady as the tools he carried. The neighborhood children loved him, their eyes brightening at the sight of him on his morning walks, his pockets filled with peppermints he'd share with a wink and a gentle pat. He knew their birthdays, watched their pets when families traveled, and mowed the widow's lawn down the street without a word. To the town, he was a quiet blessing, a man of few words but boundless heart. Yet Walter carried a private ritual few glimpsed. Every few weeks, he made his way to the post office, his cane tapping softly on the town's uneven sidewalks. The journey was slow, his breath catching at intervals, but his purpose was unshakable. At the counter, he'd slide a stamped envelope to Sally, the postmaster, its address penned in his careful hand. Once she asked if the letters were for his son, and Walter's faint smile held a depth she couldn't fathom. "No," he said softly, "these are for my old brothers." Those brothers were his fellow soldiers from Korea, men now scattered by time, some alive, others lost, their families carrying their legacy. For decades, Walter had written to them, his letters a thread binding past to present. He offered comfort, shared memories of courage and loss, and when one passed, he wrote to their children, keeping their father's story alive. When another struggled, Walter sent what he could, a modest check, a hand-carved toy for a grandchild, each crafted with the love of a man who knew the value of small gestures. These acts were his secret, a vow kept in the quiet of his heart. To the town, Walter was the gentle carpenter, the man who fixed their homes and brightened their days. But beneath his quiet demeanor was a soul shaped by loyalty and sacrifice. In Korea, he had faced horrors that lingered, friends fallen, nights of bitter cold, the weight of survival. Those memories were a wound he carried silently, yet he refused to let them harden him. Instead, he built a life of service, loving Mary with unwavering devotion, tending to his neighbors with unasked-for care, and honoring his comrades with every letter he wrote. Mrs. Franklin, a neighbor, once watched him repair her porch swing, his hands steady despite their tremble. As he worked, he hummed softly, and in his eyes she saw a man who had known great sorrow, but chose to live with greater grace. The autumn rain fell in a gentle, unhurried drizzle, cloaking the small cemetery in a quiet gray hush. Beneath the heavy sky, a modest gathering stood around a simple wooden casket, their faces etched with the weight of farewell. Walter Henderson, a man whose life had touched the town in subtle, unassuming ways, was being laid to rest. To most, he was the kind old carpenter who lived at the edge of town, a familiar figure with a warm smile and a toolbox always at the ready. But beneath the surface of his quiet existence lay a depth of experience and connection few could have imagined. A life of courage, loyalty, and unspoken generosity that stretched far beyond the boundaries of their small community. Mrs. Clara Evans, a widow who lived just down the road from Walter, stood among the mourners, her hands clasped tightly around the handle of a black umbrella. Her eyes, misty with unshed tears, lingered on the casket as memories of Walter's kindness flooded her mind. She could still picture him on her front porch, his weathered hands deftly repairing the sagging steps just weeks after her husband's passing. Clara had been overwhelmed with grief, certain she'd need to hire a stranger to fix the porch she could no longer maintain. But one crisp morning, Walter had appeared unannounced, his toolbox clinking softly as he set to work. "No need to fuss," he'd said with a gentle smile when she tried to offer payment, "just looking out for a neighbor." His refusal to accept even a doyen had left Clara speechless, her heart warmed by the quiet generosity of a man who asked for nothing in return. Now, standing at his graveside, she felt a pang of regret that she'd never truly known him. She wondered what stories lay behind his kind eyes, what burdens he'd carried in silence. Nearby, young Tommy Brooks, now a lanky high school sophomore, shifted his weight awkwardly, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket. The drizzle had dampened his hair, but he barely noticed, his thoughts drifting back to the afternoons he'd spent at Walter's house for piano lessons. Before every session, Walter would slip a peppermint into Tommy's hand, his calloused fingers brushing against the boy's palm as he offered a wink. "Keeps the music sweet," he'd say, his voice warm with humor. Tommy hadn't known much about the old man, just that he was kind, that his house smelled of wood polish and old books, and that he had a way of making you feel seen. Now, as he stared at the casket, a quiet ache settled in his chest. "You don't forget people like that," he murmured to himself, the words barely audible over the soft patter of rain. He wished he'd asked more questions, wished he'd lingered longer after those lessons to hear the stories Walter never seemed eager to tell. The pastor, a soft-spoken man with graying hair, stood at the head of the grave, his Bible held loosely in one hand. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but low, carrying just far enough to reach the small group. "We are here today to lay to rest Walter Henderson," he began, his eyes lifting briefly to the overcast sky before settling on the casket. "A man who served his country with honor and lived his life with quiet humility." His words were simple, unadorned, reflecting the modest life Walter had led in the eyes of the town. There was no grand eulogy, no recounting of heroic deeds or public achievements. The pastor offered a brief prayer, his voice blending with the rustle of wind through the leafless trees, and then fell silent, bowing his head in respect. He seemed to sense that Walter's life, though understated, carried a weight that words could only partially capture. To the side, Anna, Walter's social worker, stood clutching her umbrella, its edges trembling faintly in her grip. Her black coat was damp at the hem, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face lined with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent years caring for others. For a moment she hesitated, her gaze fixed on the casket as she gathered her thoughts. Then with a small step forward, she spoke, her voice low but clear, cutting through the stillness. "I'm Anna," she said, her words tinged with a mix of sorrow and resolve. "I was Walter's social worker these last few years." A faint, bittersweet smile crossed her lips as she glanced at the casket, her eyes softening with memory. Walter was a gentle soul. He never asked for much, even when his health started to fade. He could have moved into a care home, but he wouldn't hear of it. He wanted to stay in his house, surrounded by his memories. Anna's voice grew quieter, her words heavy with emotion. He talked about his wife, Mary, all the time. You could see how much he loved her, how much he missed her. And sometimes he'd mention his brothers, not by blood, but the men he served with. She paused, swallowing hard as a lump rose in her throat. He didn't say much about them, just enough to let you know they meant the world to him. Her eyes glistened as she looked at the casket, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought someone should say it out loud. Walter mattered. He mattered to me." Stepping back, she clutched her umbrella tighter, her shoulders trembling as she fought to hold back tears. She felt a quiet pride in having known him, but also a deep sadness that so few seemed to understand the fullness of the man they were burying. The cemetery groundskeeper, a middle-aged man named Henry, approached the grave with measured steps, his well-worn jacket speckled with rain. In his hands, he carried a small American flag, its edges slightly frayed from years of use. Kneeling beside the casket, he pressed the flag gently into the wet earth, his movements deliberate and reverent. For a moment, he rested his hand on the polished wood, his head bowed as if offering a silent tribute. Henry had seen Walter around town over the years, fixing a neighbor's fence, carrying groceries for someone struggling with their bags, but they'd never spoken much. Yet something about the old man's quiet kindness had stayed with him, a reminder of the kind of decency that seemed rare these days. Rising to his feet, Henry nodded once to the pastor and Anna before turning away, his boots leaving faint impressions in the muddy grass as he disappeared into the mist. The drizzle continued, soft and steady, its rhythm blending with the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sigh of the wind. Anna stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the casket, as if leaving would mean letting go of the man she'd come to care for. The pastor remained beside her, his head still bowed, his presence a quiet anchor in the somber moment. The cemetery felt impossibly still, the absence of sound almost palpable. No cars pulled into the lot, no distant relatives arrived with flowers or tearful embraces. No last-minute friends hurried through the gates to say goodbye. It was just the small group, the rain, and the memory of a man whose life had been both ordinary and extraordinary in ways most would never know. To the town, Walter was the old carpenter who fixed porches and handed out peppermints, a kind figure who lived quietly and died just as quietly. The news of his passing had caused only a small ripple, a brief mention in the local paper, a few murmured words between neighbors. But they didn't know about the letters he'd written, carefully penned to friends across the country, each one filled with encouragement and quiet wisdom. They didn't know about the friendships he'd maintained for decades, forged in the crucible of war and strengthened by years of loyalty. They didn't know about the countless acts of generosity, money slipped into the hands of struggling families, tools lent without expectation of return, hours spent listening to those who needed someone to hear them. And they certainly didn't know about the men who had once crouched beside Walter in frozen trenches, their breath visible in the bitter cold as they faced the chaos of war. To those men, Walter was more than a kind neighbor or a skilled carpenter. He was the steady voice that calmed their fears, the hand that pulled them to safety, the friend who shared his last piece of bread when hunger gnawed at their bones. To them, Walter Henderson was a brother, a hero, a man whose quiet strength had carried them through the darkest moments of their lives. And as the drizzle fell softly on his grave, those men, scattered across the country, their hair now gray and their steps slower, were already on their way, drawn by a bond that time and distance could never break. The farewell unfolded in a hush that felt incomplete, as if the world had paused mid-breath. A life was slipping away, not with the fanfare or grandeur typically bestowed upon heroes, but with a quiet that seemed to cradle the moment in its own tender embrace. Beneath a sky draped in soft gray, a delicate peace settled over the scene, fragile yet profound, like the last sigh of a long journey. Anna stood motionless, her heart heavy with a tangle of grief and gratitude, her eyes tracing the simple wooden casket one final time before she turned to leave. She hesitated, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and stole a final glance over her shoulder, as if hoping to imprint the moment into her soul. The pastor, his voice barely a whisper, murmured a closing blessing, his words dissolving into the mist. Nearby, the groundskeeper, his work done, melted into the shadows of the trees, leaving only the gentle patter of drizzle to fill the air. It felt like an ending, soft, unadorned, a life folding into the earth as quietly as the rain itself. But just beyond the horizon, where the road curved into the embrace of the trees, a faint stirring began, a sound that hinted at something yet to come. The cemetery lay in near silence, save for the rhythmic tap of raindrops on the sodden ground. Anna's chest tightened as she lingered, her gaze fixed on the casket, her breath catching in a small, trembling sigh. She felt the weight of the moment, the ache of a loss that was both deeply personal and impossibly vast. The pastor stood beside her, his face etched with the quiet resolve of someone who had guided countless souls through this final rite, yet even he seemed touched by the stillness of this particular farewell. As they prepared to depart, the cemetery worker had already vanished down the path, his presence as fleeting as the mist. But then, a low, distant rumble broke the quiet, a sound so faint at first that Anna thought it might be her imagination. She froze, her heart quickening, and turned toward the road that bordered the cemetery. The pastor's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder, a deep, resonant hum that cut through the rain-soaked silence like a pulse. Anna took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow, peering through the veil of mist that clung to the air. From beyond the trees, a procession emerged, deliberate and commanding. Black SUVs, their headlights piercing the gray, rolled into view, followed closely by olive-drab military jeeps, their flags snapping in the damp wind. The vehicles moved with purpose, pulling into the gravel lot beside the cemetery in a seamless, almost choreographed motion. Doors swung open in unison, and Anna's hand flew to her mouth, trembling with a mix of shock and awe. The pastor, instinctively protective, edged closer to the casket, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Figures began to step out, one by one. Men and women of every age, their postures straight, their faces solemn. They wore crisp military uniforms, some in pristine dress blues that gleamed despite the rain, others in weathered camouflage jackets adorned with patches and pins that told stories of battles long past. Among them were young soldiers, their boots polished to a mirror shine, their salutes sharp and precise, and older veterans, their faces carved with lines of experience, their movements slower but no less resolute. Over 100 strong, this sea of veterans filled the cemetery grounds, gathering beneath the bare, leafless trees. Their boots crunched softly against the wetter earth, a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the moment. Many clutched small American flags, their colors vivid against the muted landscape. Others carried wreaths or bouquets, their hands steady despite the weight of their offerings. Some wore their old unit patches or medals pinned proudly to their chests, each one a testament to a shared history, a bond forged in sacrifice. At the head of the group stood a tall man in his late 60s, his presence commanding yet understated. His silver hair was neatly combed, his uniform immaculate, the bars on his shoulder marking him as a former colonel. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept across the crowd before settling on Anna and the pastor. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rain with a clarity that demanded attention. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his tone both firm and reverent, "we're here to send Walter off the way he deserves." A ripple passed through the crowd, a collective straightening of spines, a tightening of grips on flags and caps. As one, they moved with a practiced grace, forming two precise lines along the path, an honor guard flanking the casket. Anna stood rooted to the spot, her breath shallow, her heart pounding as she watched this unexpected tribute unfold. The veterans' faces were solemn, their eyes fixed on the casket, each one carrying a private memory of the man they had come to honor. For Anna, the moment was overwhelming, a flood of emotions she could barely name. She had known Walter as a quiet man, unassuming, his stories of service tucked away like old letters in a drawer. Yet here was proof of the impact he had made, a legacy that stretched far beyond the small life she had witnessed. A lone figure stepped forward from the ranks, a bugler, his trumpet catching the faint light despite the drizzle. He raised the instrument to his lips, and the first notes of taps pierced the air, thin and haunting, like a thread of sorrow woven through the mist. The melody drifted over the cemetery, curling around the gravestones, sinking into the earth and rising into the trees. Anna felt her chest constrict, tears spilling over as the notes climbed and fell, each one a tender farewell. The pastor, who had stood at countless gravesides, felt a lump rise in his throat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The music seemed to hold the world still, a moment of pure reverence that transcended words. As the final note faded into silence, 7 uniformed veterans stepped forward, their rifles gleaming in the dim light. They raised their weapons in unison, and Anna flinched at the first sharp crack of gunfire, its suddenness shattering the quiet. The second shot followed, then the third, each one reverberating across the hills, a final salute that echoed with both pride and sorrow. From the ranks, 2 soldiers approached the casket, their faces set with quiet determination. They unfolded an American flag with deliberate care, their movements precise and reverent, as if the fabric itself held the weight of Walter's life. Anna watched, her heart full, as the flag was stretched taut, its stars and stripes a vivid contrast against the gray scheme. This was no ordinary farewell. It was a tribute, a recognition of a life that had touched so many, a man whose quiet courage had rippled through the years, bringing this army of comrades to stand in his honor. The soldiers moved with quiet precision, their hands steady as they draped the American flag over Walter's casket. Each motion was deliberate, a silent testament to respect, as they smoothed every crease with care, ensuring the fabric lay perfectly across the polished wood. Their synchronized movements carried the weight of tradition, a ritual honed by years of honoring the fallen. When the flag was set, they stepped back in unison, their boots barely disturbing the damp earth. With crisp salutes, they turned their gazes toward the colonel, who stood waiting, his face a mask of stoic resolve. The colonel approached the casket slowly, his shoulders squared, but his steps softer than usual. For a moment he paused, his hand hovering above the wood before settling gently on its surface. His fingers lingered, tracing the grain as if he could reach through time to grasp the man Walter had been. His stern features softened, and a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face, a rare crack in his otherwise unyielding demeanor. "Rest well, Walter," he whispered, his voice low but carrying a depth of emotion that reached those standing closest. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken gratitude and farewell. With the moment past, the 2 soldiers returned to the flag, lifting it with reverence to begin the folding. Their hands worked in perfect harmony, each fold a precise triangle, each corner sharp and intentional. The rhythm of their movements was almost meditative, a silent prayer woven into the fabric. When the final fold was tucked into place, they turned to the pastor, who stood with his hands outstretched, ready to receive the sacred bundle. The soldiers placed the flag in his palms with a gentleness that belied their disciplined exteriors, and the pastor clutched it to his chest, his head bowing under the weight of its significance. Anna stood nearby, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the ceremony unfold. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she reached up to brush it away, her fingers trembling. The moment felt overwhelming, as if the air itself was thick with the gravity of loss and honor. Her heart ached with a mixture of pride and sorrow, emotions swirling within her as she grappled with the finality of Walter's departure. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain on the grass, the faint shuffle of boots, and the gentle rustle of flags rippling in the breeze. The silence was sacred, a collective pause to hold space for a life well lived. As if guided by an unspoken signal, the veterans began to move, filing out with their heads held high and their shoulders squared. Their faces bore the marks of time and service, yet their steps were resolute, a testament to the brotherhood they shared with Walter. Some paused at the casket, their hands reaching out to place small tokens of remembrance. Challenge coins, patches medals, and folded notes, each one a piece of their shared history. Others simply stood for a moment, offering a silent salute or a brief touch to the wood, their gestures heavy with unspoken farewell. Anna watched them go, her chest swelling with a bittersweet ache. Walter had not faced his final journey alone. His brothers in arms had come to see him off, granting him the send-off of a true hero. As the last car pulled away, its headlights fading into the mist, Anna and the pastor remained at the edge of the cemetery. The folded flag rested between them, its weight a tangible reminder of Walter's legacy. The rain fell softly, a gentle curtain that seemed to shroud them in quiet reflection. For Anna, the moment marked the closing of a chapter, yet her heart was full of gratitude for the men who had honored Walter's memory with such dignity. As the rain softened to a faint mist, a few veterans lingered at the graveside, their faces etched with quiet reverence. Anna, still cradling the folded flag, felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to see an older man in uniform, his silver hair neatly tucked beneath his cap. Deep lines framed his eyes, but there was a warmth in his expression that cut through the somber air. "You must be Anna," he said, his voice kind and steady. "I'm Frank Collins. I served with Walter in Korea." Anna's breath hitched. She had known Walter was a veteran, but to hear someone speak of standing beside him in the crucible of war was a revelation that stirred her deeply. Her eyes widened, and she felt a rush of curiosity mingled with awe. Frank gestured toward a small group of veterans gathered nearby, their voices low as they shared memories of their fallen comrade. "There's something you should know about Walter," he said softly, his tone carrying the weight of a long-held truth. "Most folks around here, the town, his neighbors, they didn't know the full story. But to us, Walter was a hero." Frank's words opened a door to a past Anna had only glimpsed in fragments. He began to recount Walter's service in the Korean War, his voice thick with the weight of memory. Walter had served in one of the most perilous combat zones, a place where survival was a daily gamble. During a brutal winter, their unit had been trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from the supplies and surrounded in the unforgiving hills. The cold was relentless, and many were wounded, starving, and on the brink of despair. It was Walter who rose to the challenge, night after night, slipping through enemy territory with a courage that bordered on the miraculous. He brought back medicine, food, and ammunition, each trip a defiance of death itself. "He saved dozens of us," Frank said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He dragged wounded men out of the snow, patched them up, carried them on his back when they couldn't walk. He refused to leave anyone behind." Anna listened in stunned silence, her heart pounding as tears pricked her eyes. She could almost see Walter in her mind's eye. Young, determined, his face set with resolve as he moved through the darkness to save his brothers. The image was both humbling and overwhelming, a testament to a man whose quiet life had belied such extraordinary bravery. Frank's voice softened as he continued. He was awarded the Silver Star for bravery. But you know what's remarkable? When he came home, he didn't make a fuss about it, never hung up his medals, never told his neighbors. His just quiet life went back to being Walter. The simplicity of it struck Anna deeply. Walter had carried the weight of his heroism in silence, choosing humility over recognition. It was a choice that spoke volumes about his character, and it made her heart ache with admiration. As other veterans joined the conversation, they wove together a richer portrait of Walter's life. Anna learned that his service hadn't ended with the war. For decades, he had remained a steadfast presence for his comrades, a lifeline in times of need. Those letters she'd seen him mail at the post office every few weeks weren't mere pleasantries. They were anchors for men adrift in the aftermath of war. "Whenever one of us was struggling," one veteran said quietly, "Walter was there. He sent money when bills piled up, called when the world felt too heavy, mailed gifts to our kids. Sometimes it was just a note to remind us we weren't alone." Anna's heart swelled with pride and sorrow as she absorbed their words. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of Walter's life, revealing a man whose quiet acts of kindness had rippled far beyond what she'd ever imagined. The flag in her hands felt heavier now, not just a symbol of service, but a testament to a life lived with unwavering loyalty and love. The word "forgotten," etched in delicate, unpretentious letters, on the modest headstone, held a weight far beyond its simplicity. To the passing eye, it might have seemed like nothing more than a quiet marker for a quiet man. But to those who knew Walter, those small letters were his unspoken vow, his way of tethering his brothers in arms to one another, even as time silvered their hair and thinned their ranks. Walter had always been the steady hand, the one who bound them together when the world threatened to pull them apart. And now, standing in the rain-soaked cemetery, they had come to honor that bond one final time. A young man, perhaps in his early 30s, stepped forward from the small cluster of mourners. His military uniform was pristine, every crease sharp, every button gleaming, despite the gray, drizzling sky. His face, though composed, betrayed a storm of emotion in his dark eyes which shimmered with unshed tears. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "My father served with Walter," he began, his words carrying across the hushed gathering. He paused, glancing down at the ground as if to gather the strength to continue. "One night in the dead of winter, my dad was wounded in a minefield. The cold was so brutal it felt like the air itself was cutting into you. He thought he was done for, left to die in that frozen hell. But Walter," his voice cracked slightly and he swallowed hard, "Walter carried him out, step by careful step through that deadly maze with bullets still flying. My dad always told me, if it weren't for Walter, you wouldn't be standing here today. So I came." He lifted his gaze, meeting the eyes of those around him. "I came to stand here for him, because of him." Anna, standing nearby with a folded flag cradled in her arms, felt her breath catch. Her hand instinctively rose to her mouth, pressing against her lips as if to hold back the tide of emotions swelling within her. Her heart ached, not just with sorrow, but with a profound awe for the man Walter had been. A man whose quiet heroism had rippled through lives she'd never even known about. Beside her, Frank stood tall, his weathered face thoughtful, his eyes tracing the horizon as if searching for memories of his old friend. His silence spoke volumes, a testament to the depth of his respect, the weight of his loss. When Walter's passing had been announced in a brief, unassuming obituary tucked into the corner of the local paper, the news had spread like wildfire through the fragile network of veterans who had once fought side by side. Many hadn't seen each other in years, their lives scattered by time and distance. But the moment they saw Walter's name in print, something stirred within them. A shared resolve, a debt that could never be repaid but could at least be honored. They knew they had to come. They owed him that much, and more. Frank's gaze swept across the cemetery, taking in the small group of veterans who had gathered. Some leaned on canes, others stood with shoulders squared despite their age. Their hands rested on each other's shoulders, a silent gesture of camaraderie, their head bowed in reverence. "We couldn't let him go alone," Frank said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Walter never left any of us behind, not in the war, not in the years after. We weren't about to leave him now." In that moment, Anna began to see Walter in a new light. He wasn't just the quiet carpenter who lived in the modest house at the edge of town, the man who fixed porch steps and built birdhouses for neighbors without ever asking for payment. He was something far greater, a thread woven through the fabric of countless lives, binding them across generations. He had given everything, his strength, his courage, his heart, without ever seeking recognition or gratitude. And now, as she stood among those who had come to say goodbye, Anna felt the enormity of his legacy settle over her like a warm, heavy blanket. As the last notes of the trumpet's mournful melody drifted into the damp air, and the sharp crack of the gun's salute faded into a distant echo, something unexpected began to unfold. The cemetery, which had been nearly empty save for the handful of veterans and mourners, started to hum with life. Anna turned, her eyes widening as she heard the soft squelch of footsteps on the wet grass. At the wrought iron gates, a crowd was gathering, townsfolk she recognized from the everyday rhythms of life. There was Mr. Thompson from the grocery store, his apron still tied around his waist, his face etched with quiet respect. Larson from the post office stood beside him, clutching a small umbrella, her eyes red-rimmed. Even Jenny, the waitress from the diner, was there, her coat thrown haphazardly over her uniform, her expression solemn. Word of Walter's passing had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated, and the people of the town were answering the call. One by one they came. Some carried umbrellas, their shoes sinking into the muddy ground. Others had come in such a hurry they hadn't thought to grab a coat, their clothes dampening in the steady rain, but their faces were set with determination. Children trailed behind their parents, their small faces curious and wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they didn't fully understand it. Anna's gaze fell on Mrs. Franklin, the elderly widow whose sagging porch Walter had repaired years ago, free of charge. The old woman's hands trembled as she approached, clutching a modest bouquet of wildflowers she must have picked from her garden. She pressed them into Anna's hands with a fragile smile, her eyes glistening. "He was a good man," she whispered, her voice quivering. Then she stepped toward the casket, bowed her head, and murmured a prayer, her words lost to the rain, but heavy with meaning. The local police chief arrived next, his uniform crisp despite the weather, flanked by 2 officers who stood respectfully at his side. They removed their hats, holding them over their hearts, their head bowed in silent tribute. A short while later, the town's mayor appeared, weaving through the growing crowd to stand near the pastor. His hand rested over his chest, his lips moving in a quiet, personal farewell. His eyes misty with an emotion he didn't try to hide. Anna watched it all unfold, her throat tightening until it felt like she could barely breathe. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, a mix of grief and gratitude so overwhelming it threatened to break her. One of the veterans beside her gently touched her arm, drawing her attention to the road beyond the cemetery gates. There, standing in a hesitant cluster, was a small group of teenagers, boys Anna often saw loitering near the gas station, their laughter sometimes too loud, their edges a little rough. Today, though, they were different. They stood in silence, their usual bravado stripped away. One of them, a lanky kid with a mop of dark hair, shuffled his feet, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. His eyes were fixed on the casket, his expression almost ashamed, as if he regretted every moment he'd spent being careless or unkind. Another boy, shorter and stockier, swiped his sleeve across his face, pretending the rain was to blame for the redness in his eyes. Anna's breath hitched, and she felt her own tears slip free, warm against her cold cheeks, unstoppable now. The folded flag in her arms seemed to grow heavier, not with physical weight, but with the profound significance it carried. It was more than fabric. It was a symbol of Walter's life, his sacrifices, his unwavering loyalty to those he loved and served. Anna's voice broke as she whispered, her words barely audible but brimming with conviction. "You were never alone, Walter. You were never alone." The crowd stood in silence for a long moment, the soft patter of rain blending with the quiet sounds of life. A child's sniffle, the clearing of a throat, the gentle shuffle of feet on wet grass. The air was thick with shared sorrow, but also with something else, something warm, something enduring. Walter's legacy, Anna realized, wasn't just in the lives he'd saved or the deeds he'd done. It was in this moment, in the people who had come to honor him, in the quiet, unspoken love that bound them all together. And as the rain fell and the world stood still, Anna knew that Walter, wherever he was, could feel it too. A gentle rain draped the cemetery, each droplet a quiet witness to the gathering that unfolded around Walter Henderson's grave. One by one, townsfolk approached the simple wooden casket, their steps hesitant yet deliberate, as if drawn by an unspoken call to pay their respects. Some carried vibrant bouquets of flowers, roses and lilies that trembled slightly in their hands, laying them tenderly at the grave's edge, their colors stark against the muted earth. Others, with no offerings but their presence, reached out to touch the casket, their fingers lingering as if to bridge the distance between the living and the man who had slipped quietly from their world. A few leaned close, whispering words too soft to carry beyond the moment, prayers, apologies, or perhaps gratitude for a life they only now began to understand. Each gesture, though small, wove a tapestry of reverence, transforming the once lonely plot into a sacred space. Among the mourners, a group of teenagers stood at a distance, their usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. They shuffled their feet, exchanging glances that betrayed their uncertainty about how to honor a man they'd barely known. Yet something stirred within them, a sense of duty perhaps, or the weight of the stories they had heard about Walter's quiet heroism. Finally, as if buoyed by a collective resolve, They moved forward together, forming a tight line at the graveside. Their heads bowed low, not out of obligation, but from a deep, instinctive respect that needed no words. Their silence spoke louder than any speech, a testament to the power of a life lived humbly yet profoundly. In that moment, the fear of a solitary farewell that had loomed over Walter's passing dissolved. The town, though late in its awakening, had come with hearts laid bare, ready to honor a man whose presence they'd overlooked, but whose absence they now felt keenly. As the rain fell in a steady, soothing rhythm, a group of veterans gathered near the grave, their weathered faces etched with memories of battles fought and comrades lost. They stood close, their camaraderie a silent anchor in the somber scene. Without a word, as if guided by a shared instinct, they began to sing. The opening notes of God Bless America rose from their throats, rough and unpolished, yet brimming with a raw, unshakable passion. The melody wove through the air, each voice blending into a harmony that carried the weight of their shared sacrifices. Some sang with eyes squeezed shut, lost in memories of distant fields and fallen friends. Others placed hands over their hearts, their fingers trembling slightly with the emotion of the moment. A few draped arms around each other's shoulders, finding strength in the familiar warmth of their brothers in arms. The song swelled, its notes mingling with the patter of rain, drifting across the rows of headstones and climbing toward the heavy gray sky. When the final chorus faded, a profound stillness settled over the crowd, as if the world itself paused to honor the song's lingering echo. From the group of veterans, an older man stepped forward, his military uniform sagging under the weight of medals that gleamed dully in the dim light. His face was a map of grief and pride, each wrinkle telling a story of service and loss. In his hands, he cradled a small, weathered badge, Walter's unit insignia, polished to a soft, reverent shine. The sight of it stirred something deep within him, a flood of memories of a younger Walter, steadfast and unassuming, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in moments of unimaginable trial. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the pastor and Anna, Walter's widow, who stood near the grave, her eyes glistening with the unshed tears. The veteran's voice was low, almost a whisper as he spoke. "I think this belongs here," he said, his words heavy with meaning. Together, the three of them knelt by a small stone marker near the grave, placing the insignia with care, as if entrusting it to the earth itself. The badge settled into place, a quiet symbol of a life defined by duty and sacrifice, destined to stand as a lasting tribute to a hero who had never sought the spotlight. The scene shifted as if viewed through a lens pulling back to reveal the full transformation of Walter's resting place. Hours earlier, the grave had been a stark, lonely patch of earth, unnoticed in the corner of the cemetery. Now it was a vibrant shrine to a life well lived. The ground was adorned with American flags, their stars and stripes fluttering gently in the breeze. Fresh flowers spilled across the soil, their petals catching the rain like tiny jewels. Handwritten notes, some smudged by the damp, bore messages of gratitude and remembrance, while military pins glinted among the offerings, each one a token of respect from those who understood the cost of service. The grave was no longer a forgotten corner, but a place of honor, a beacon of the community's newfound resolve to remember one of their own. The headstone, simple yet dignified, bore the inscription, Walter Henderson, 1938-2022, beloved husband, soldier, friend. The words captured the essence of a man whose life had been defined by love, duty, and quiet strength. As the rain softened to a delicate mist, a voice broke the silence, steady and solemn. "We must never forget those who gave without asking for anything in return," it said. "A strong society is not measured by its wealth, but by how it honors its humblest souls." The words hung in the air, a call to carry forward the legacy of men and women like Walter, whose contributions often went unnoticed until they were gone. The image of the grave began to fade, leaving behind the faint sound of wind rustling through the flags, their soft flutter a reminder of the enduring presence of a man who had lived quietly but left a legacy that would resonate for generations. In the quiet corner of the cemetery, Walter Henderson's story had found its voice, not through fanfare, but through the collective actions of a community that had come to recognize his worth. His life, though unassuming, had touched countless others in ways he could never have imagined, and his memory now stood as a reminder of the quiet heroism that surrounds us every day. The rain continued to mist, and the cemetery fell silent, but the echo of Walter's legacy lingered, a testament to the power of a life lived with purpose, with honor, and with heart.